Okay, we're studying Galatians. Now, in Galatians, in chapter 1:13, down through chapter 2, verse 10, Paul he's correcting a false history about his gospel that the Judaizers had circulated among the Galatians. I can see this earpiece is going to bug me today. Okay. But you can tell that they have put out some stories about the history of his gospel, and he's correcting that. He says in chapter 1:13 to 17 that contrary to what the Galatians may have heard, he didn't consult with anybody immediately after he converted, nor did he go to Jerusalem to receive his gospel secondhand. That's not what happened at all. Rather, he went into Arabia, into Nabatea, and then he returned to Damascus. And he says in verses 18 to 20 that he first returned to Jerusalem after his conversion. It was 3 years after that conversion, and that he stayed only 15 days, and he saw only Cephas and James, the Lord's brother. So if anybody's claiming that he went to Jerusalem and received a warped gospel from somebody who didn't have it on straight, well, that's just a flat-out lie. And if anybody's claiming that his authority to preach was derived from those in Jerusalem, and that his alleged straying from the gospel they had given him was therefore invalid because he received it from them and then he perverted it, well, if that's what they're saying, that's hardly consistent with the brevity of his visit and with his only seeing 2 leaders. So essentially what I see Paul saying here, look, he didn't receive a perverted gospel, and he didn't get one from some authoritative source and then go rogue with the gospel. So he's setting that straight and letting them know that. He says in 1:21 to 24 that he didn't preach in the churches of Judea outside of Jerusalem. Now, presumably the Judaizers had claimed that he had. That they were perhaps suggesting, look, when Paul tried his stuff in the churches in Judea, among those who really know the Jewish scriptures, well, he didn't have a very good reception. And Paul's saying, I didn't preach there. They didn't know me by face. They only knew that the guy who persecuted the church had converted, and they glorified God because of me. And so he's setting that right. Now, when we ended, we were looking at chapter 2, 1 to 10. So I want to reread that, and then Paul is continuing here to correct the false history about his gospel that had been spread among the churches in Galatia. Let me read this, and then I'll pick back up where we were. He says, then after 14 years, that's 14 years after his conversion, we're talking about 46, 47, he said, I again went up to Jerusalem with Barnabas, having also taken Titus along. Now I went up in accordance with a revelation, and I set before them the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to those reputed to be important, lest I somehow should run or did run in vain. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, though being a Greek. Now this arose on account of the infiltrating false brothers who slipped in to spy on our freedom which we have in Christ Jesus, in order that they might enslave us, to whom we did not yield in submission for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might remain with you. But as for those reputed to be important, whatever they once were does not matter to me. God does not show partiality. Those reputed to be important added nothing to me. On the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel of the uncircumcision, as Peter that of the circumcision, for he who worked in Peter for an apostleship of the circumcision also worked in me for the Gentiles, and knowing the grace that had been given to me, James and Cephas and John, those reputed to be pillars, gave to me and to Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, so that we should be for the Gentiles and they for the circumcision. They ask only that we should remember the poor, which very thing I also was eager to do. Now, Paul says he didn't go up to Jerusalem again for 14 years after his conversion, and that's certainly odd behavior, right? For somebody who is subordinate to the Jerusalem leaders. I mean, if he'd received the gospel from them, been sent out by them or something like that, for him to go 14 years without going back there. That doesn't seem consistent. And he says that even that visit, when he went 14 years after his conversion, even that visit was in accordance with the revelation. And he's referring, I'm convinced, to the revelation about the coming famine that you see in Acts chapter 11, verse 30. And at that time, he says he privately presented his gospel to those, and the way I've rendered it is reputed to be important. It literally says for those who seem, or those who appear. And that's what that means, is that those who seem important. And so those reputed to be important, to those promoted by the Judaizers as the bastions of the true gospel. You see, they're saying something, Paul's stuff is off. The guys who are really in the know, and Paul is talking about those people. He presented his gospel to those that the Judaizers themselves would acknowledge as bastions of the true gospel. And as chapter 2, verse 9 makes clear, that included James, Peter, and John. So you're talking about some serious weight there from somebody who's saying, well, we're really, we're into Jewishness. Well, you've got James, Peter, John, and so you have those. He says, look, they are part of, I presented it to them. And he presented the gospel to them. He says, lest somehow I should run or did run in vain. Now that doesn't mean that he doubted the authenticity of his gospel, as though he was bringing it to them to check his gospel for correctness. That would be contrary to everything that he said. Well, I didn't know, I didn't know what I was saying. I had to go up here and get it confirmed by people who really knew. Well, he's not saying that at all, right? That's not his point. Rather, his labor, Paul's labor, was to extend the one church. It was to extend the one church of Jews and Gentiles. And if the Jerusalem church, if that church had wrongly rejected fellowship with Gentiles, well, then Christ would be divided and Paul's goal would be frustrated. His efforts of extending the one church of Jew and Gentile, all that he's laboring for, if the Jerusalem church had wrongly rejected fellowship with the Gentiles, well, then the goal of his efforts would be frustrated. So that's what he's talking about, to see if I did run or had run, or, when he says if I should run or did run in vain. And the fact the pillars added nothing, that they added nothing to Paul's message, and that they gave Paul and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that proves that the Judaizers are either lying or they're misinformed about the correctness of Paul's gospel, right? I mean, the very apostles that the Judaizers hold out as, bastions of the true gospel, they approved the gospel that Paul preaches. What more do you want? James, are those who are considered the rocks, the pillars. They approve the gospel Paul preaches. Well, how then could his gospel be deviant? How could that possibly be the case? Now note that the pillars ratified Paul's gospel. It says because they saw he had been entrusted with the gospel. See, meaning he had been entrusted with it by God. It's a divine passive, that he had been entrusted with the gospel by God. Thomas Schreiner, he rightly notes, he says the Jerusalem leaders did not establish Paul's authority. They only recognized that God had given him such authority. And that's what Paul has said. Paul says, my stuff's coming straight from the Lord. Okay? It is not mediated to me through the authority of the Jerusalem leaders. And they recognized that when they saw that he had been entrusted with the gospel. Now, presumably they recognized this from the information they had received about Paul's work among the Gentiles in Syria and Cilicia, the work he referred to in chapter 1, verses 21 to 24, and in Antioch, where Paul had labored for quite some time. Now, in saying the leaders recognized that he'd been entrusted by God with the gospel of the uncircumcision, meaning the gospel of the Gentiles, as Peter had been entrusted with that of the circumcision, meaning the gospel of the Jews. He's not speaking of two different gospels. That's not what he's talking about. He's referring to two different cultures in which the one gospel is proclaimed. I mean, after all, we know in Ephesians 4, right? There's one body, one spirit, one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father. There's one faith. There aren't multiple gospels. And so Paul is saying that they're presenting the one gospel, but they're presenting it in different cultural contexts. So they had two different primary fields of service, not exclusive. Paul's not above preaching to the Jews, is he? But they had two different primary fields of service. Paul's primary field of service was to the Gentiles. And so God had entrusted him with that. And it's saying in chapter 2, verse 6, of those who were reputed to be important, he says, whatever they once were doesn't matter to me. God doesn't show partiality. He's cautioning them. He's cautioning them about venerating the leaders simply because they had been disciples of Jesus during his earthly ministry. You see, the issue is always divine truth. That's always the issue. It's not the status or the background of any individual. It is the divine truth. So Paul's gospel is from God. If Paul would say, look, my gospel's not on trial. My gospel is from God. So if the pillars should reject it, which they didn't, but if the pillars, even though they're pillars, even though they had traveled with Jesus, if they should reject his gospel, that would be too bad for them. Because they, in that case, would be rejecting divine truth. And that's what matters. And Paul knows his gospel is divine truth. And of course, they didn't reject it. Now, the fact Titus was not compelled, he says in verses 3 to 5, the fact Titus was not compelled to be circumcised during that visit, well, that further proves the correctness of his gospel. The fact those infiltrating false brothers, the fact the infiltrating false brothers sought to compel Titus, a Gentile Christian, to be circumcised, well, that shows who they are. They're Judaizers. Infiltrating false brothers who were trying to compel him to be circumcised, they are Judaizers. This was something they deemed essential for salvation. So they're saying, look, Titus, okay, baptized into Christ, fine. But if he wants to be saved, he's going to have to convert to Judaism. He's going to have to be circumcised and come under the entire Mosaic covenant. All of the laws that are part of that. He's going to have to do that. And Paul says, look, the fact he wasn't compelled to be circumcised proves the correctness of his gospel. And the fact you had Judaizers who were pressing to have Titus circumcised because he has to do that for salvation, that distinguishes that case from the case of Timothy. Right, in Acts chapter 16, where Paul gladly circumcised Timothy, but as a matter of evangelistic strategy. Right, as a matter of evangelistic strategy, he just said, well, why don't we go ahead and do this? Because that may reduce some barriers. That's completely different than somebody saying, you have to be circumcised as a sign of coming under the law of Moses or you cannot be saved. Convert to Judaism or you cannot be saved. Well, that's completely different. Absolutely. And in a context like that, where circumcision is being pushed, circumcision representing submission to the Mosaic law, where that's being demanded as a condition for salvation, well, Paul flat refused to comply with that. And he did so because his doing so in that context would lend credence to that damning lie that you have to convert to Judaism to be saved. So he's not about to lend any credibility to that. So where you have people, and he says he brings Titus down, the infiltrating false brothers, they're trying to have Titus circumcised because they're Judaizers and say, you've got to do that. So they've put that theological issue at stake. And in that context, Paul said, wild horses would not make me circumcise him, because I would in that case be lending credence to the lie. And it's a damning lie. And I simply will not do it. Now, the fact that stance was accepted, it wasn't just Paul saying that. Paul's stance on that was accepted, and you see that by the fact that Titus was not compelled to be circumcised by others. And see, so what does that say? That says that Paul's gospel was accepted. And you see, he's trying to convince the Galatians that they're making a bad move in swallowing what the Judaizers are saying about him and in turning to their false gospel and rejecting his. Now, note Paul's strong language toward the Judaizers. I mean, Paul doesn't mince words towards them. He calls them infiltrating false brothers who slipped in among them with ulterior motives. Why did they slip? They slipped in to spy on the freedom that we have in Christ. And they slipped in for the ultimate purpose of enslaving them by binding the Mosaic law on them. That was their agenda. That's what they were about. And Paul's talk about these Judaizers, well, he already started with it, but it will continue through the letter. These people are serious. They're heretics. And they're not to be messed with. Now, the importance of the issue in Paul's mind, it's again suggested in chapter 2, verse 5, to have accepted the necessity of submission to the law would have been to pervert the truth of the gospel. You see, it's that serious. The Judaizers' doctrine, it's incompatible with the gospel of Jesus Christ because its effect in the new covenant age, its effect in the era of the new covenant, after Christ has come, the effect of what they're saying is to throw one on one's own obedience for a relationship with God. That's the effect of the Judaizers' gospel. And so it's heretical, because you wind up, you're stuck here then with relating to God in the terms of that obsolete covenant, and that will damn you. And so it's very serious, and Paul doesn't mince words about it. Now, the leaders ask only, in verse 10, they ask only that Paul and Barnabas should remember the poor. Now, meaning in the first instance, the poor among the believers. You see, there's this idea in the church, you see, that there is the body and the family here first we are to be concerned about. We're concerned about everybody, but there is a special attachment and a caring for our brothers and sisters. And you see that. Now, I think about that just in the church today. You know, we have concerns about poor people. I just want to make sure that we first make sure we're looking at poor people among us and that we're doing what we need to do there, and then let's go beyond. But I just think there's a focal point there. So Paul declares that they asked Paul, they said, look, just remember the poor. And he says that he was already eager to do that very thing. They weren't putting anything new on Paul. It wasn't like, okay, Paul, you're almost there. Here's what you need now. Paul says, you know, I was eager to do that. In fact, he's in Jerusalem delivering the famine relief to the saints. That's the very visit in Acts 11, 27 to 30. So they're really just asking him to continue what he's already been doing. They're not putting anything new on him. Then Paul says in 2, 11 to 14, he says, but when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he was under condemnation. For before certain men came from James, he ate with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself because he feared those of the circumcision group. And the rest of the Jews also joined with him in playing the hypocrite, so that even Barnabas was led away by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in front of them all, If you, though being a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? Now this is serious, right? This is weighty right here. Now regarding Paul's confrontation here, this confrontation that he has with Peter in Antioch, we just looked at in 11 to 14, we can't be certain of how long before Paul wrote Galatians that the incident occurred. We can't be sure of it, but there are some clues that point to it probably occurring shortly after Paul and Barnabas returned to Antioch after their first missionary journey. There are some clues that point that way. The fact that Paul reports the confrontation, he reports that after reporting his second visit to Jerusalem, that famine relief visit that he just talked about, that's in Acts 11:27. So that visit's around 46, 47. He reports this confrontation right after reporting that visit, and he does so by saying, "But when?" And that most naturally reads like the confrontation followed the Jerusalem famine visit of 46 and 47. The sense is, as Moo points out, it says, at Jerusalem, Cephas and I agreed on the gospel, but when he came to Antioch, ... You see, so it seems that it's after that visit. Indeed, the strength of the language that Paul uses to criticize Peter, it's more understandable if Peter had earlier acknowledged the propriety of Paul's gospel, which is what Paul says he did in Galatians chapter 2, 1 to 10. So that's the first thing, is it looks to me like it's after that famine relief visit of 46, 47. And you say, okay, well, the first missionary journey is after that famine relief visit. So is there anything that would indicate whether or not it happened before or after the after the first missionary journey? And I think there is. I think there are clues. The first missionary journey, it's soon after the famine relief visit to Jerusalem. And if this confrontation with Peter, if that had occurred before the first missionary journey, I can't imagine Paul not, when he goes to spread the gospel among Gentiles in the southern political province of Galatia, that he would not have armed them about that he would not have told them about that theological danger. If he had just had this big dust up and he saw how dangerous this was, I can't imagine when he goes here and preaches to these guys, he wouldn't warn them about that danger. The fact he did not warn them about that danger, you say, well, how do you know that? Because if he had, he would have said in his letter, as I told you. You remember, I told you that. Okay, so the fact that he didn't do that makes me think that this dust-up happened after they returned from that first missionary journey. Now, the statement in verse 14, where he says, but when I saw that they were not acting in line with the gospel, well, it suggests, it seems like the deterioration was already at an advanced state when it came to Paul's attention. Maybe, as many people suppose, Paul at the very time, Peter comes, he's eating with the Gentiles, Paul is called away to some place nearby to do something, and then come those of the circumcision, and they come, and then we have this deviation, or we wind up having this defection, and then Paul returns to find a congregation that has lapsed into Jew-Gentile segregation. And when he sees that, otherwise it seems that Paul would have gotten involved earlier. It seems as soon as the intimidation had begun, that Paul would have been in there saying no. So maybe, but we don't know that. Okay, I'm just speculating for you. I think that makes sense when he says, when I saw it, seems to be in an advanced state of deterioration when he comes back, and you could put it together that way. Say maybe he was there when Peter was eating with him, he comes back, something's happened, and when Paul sees that, then he challenges it. And that makes some sense to me. Now, some notable scholars are convinced that what happened with Paul and Peter in Antioch is that certain men actually were sent from James. that certain men actually were sent from James, and they informed Peter that his table fellowship with the Gentiles in Antioch, that was endangering Jewish Christians in Jerusalem and elsewhere in Judea by agitating the non-Christian Jews. You see, it was endangering that way, and therefore it was increasing the risk of persecution. So James, under this idea, he sends some Jewish Christians. He actually sends them with a message to Peter and says, hey, your eating with the Gentiles is causing danger down here because the non-Christian Jews are really getting upset about it, and you are increasing the risk of persecution of them. So that's one idea of what's happened. In other words, they understand that certain men from James, you see in verse 12 there, before certain men came from James, they understand that then to be that men who actually came from James with a message from James. And they understand the circumcision to refer to a different group, to refer to non-Christian Jews. Okay, so that's one way of looking at it. So Peter's fear of what those non-Christian Jews may do to the Jewish Christians prompted him to separate from the Gentile Christians. Now, I and many other people think that it's more likely that the people who came, quote, from James, that they were Judaizers. They were representatives. They weren't two different groups. They were representatives of the circumcision group. And they came, quote, from James only in a very loose sense. You see, they weren't sent by James. They came from James either in that the Jerusalem church was identified with James as being a prominent person who spent the most time there, or they're the conservative or law-conscious element of the Gentile church was somehow identified with James, but only this loose kind of identification and not actually being sent out as an emissary of James with a message from James. Just some kind of loose connection coming from James. In other words, they weren't actually James's agents. They simply came from that group that was in some sense identified with James. Now that fits. You say, well, why would you think that? Well, a number of reasons, but it fits with Acts chapter 15, verse 1, where Luke says, some men came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. So this seems just what I'm reading, that here he says some people came down, quote, from James. Now what are these guys? They're coming down and they're teaching this Judaizing doctrine. And then in 15:24 of Acts 15:24, it makes clear that though these men, they went out from the Jerusalem congregation, they didn't have any authorization or any commission to spread their views among the Gentiles. He says that in 15:24. They went out, they weren't authorized from us. They disturbed you, but we didn't send them as our emissaries. Okay, well, that's what I think's going on. I think the Judaizers have come loosely identified as from James simply because they're coming from the group, the congregation, or whatever. They are not authorized to speak on behalf of the apostles, and they are here selling their Judaizing stuff when Peter is there in Antioch. Now, part of what makes me think it was Judaizers who came is Paul's assertion in verse 14 that Peter's action, he says, it amounted to compelling the Gentiles to live like Jews. That was the import of Peter's separation. It was a compelling the Gentiles to live like Jews. Now his withdrawal from table fellowship with Gentile Christians wouldn't amount to compelling the Gentiles to live like Jews if he did so in a context where it was clear that he was simply acting from some personal conscience or personal decision, that he thought it wise to do that. You see, that wouldn't compel them. It's withdrawing from fellowship in the context of where people are insisting that living under the Mosaic law that you have to do that. It's withdrawing from table fellowship in that context, where people are saying, listen, you have to come under the Mosaic law with its dietary and purity restrictions. That's essential for salvation. In that context, for him to withdraw, for him to cease to eat, well, that would then be compulsion on the Gentiles, because what you would be saying is, I agree with that you must be circumcised and convert to Judaism if you want to be saved. Well, that's compelling. You see, that's compelling. Now you're telling me that I have to do it for salvation. And so I think they are Judaizers who are coming down. Now you recall, as I mentioned just a little while ago, that Paul, he had no problem circumcising Timothy as a matter of evangelistic strategy, right? He was perfectly willing to do that. But he absolutely refused to circumcise Titus, where the Judaizers were insisting that to do so, that they were insisting that that was necessary for salvation. And in that context, you see, for him to do that, for him to go along with that demand of circumcision, that would be denying the truth of the gospel. And it would be that because he would be consenting implicitly to the false assertion that Christians were obligated to obey the Mosaic law. And I think that Peter's conduct at Antioch was like that. In other words, I think that Peter's separating from the Gentiles in that context was saying that it was lending credence to that. And that's part of what's wrong with it. Now, if the men who came from James, if they're in fact Judaizers, as I think they are, well, then Peter's fear, it may have been more personal. Like under the one idea, you're saying, well, no, he's just doing this in wisdom to keep the Jewish Christians in Judea from being persecuted by the non-Christian Jews. But if I'm correct that this is Judaizers, well, then his fear is more personal. Now, it's possible they personally intimidated him into pulling back. Now, I understand that's hard to believe. And I agree. It's not easy to see Peter as somebody who would be personally intimidated. I mean, when you think about Peter's courage before the Jewish authorities, it's recorded in Acts. When you think about the 7 or 8 years earlier, Peter, at God's direction, he had preached to the Gentile Cornelius and had defended that action before the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. And when you think that 2 or 3 years earlier, he had heard Paul's gospel and had extended to him the right hand of fellowship. So I grant that it seems difficult to accept that Peter could be personally intimidated, but then again, the pressure may have been heightened. The pressure may have been heightened by the growing influence of the zealot movement within Judaism. I mentioned this before. Starting around 44, you had the zealot movement, this political movement within Judaism, which is saying, look, what we want to do is we want to purify Judaism of Gentile influences. And so you have this very anti-Gentile move, and this goes up all the way to the beginning of the Jewish War in 66. So, this is happening beforehand. So this may have ratcheted up the pressure on Peter, and it could be Peter may have given into that fears, because he could justify it with the claim. You know how this works, at least in my life. What's dangerous is when I have some available rationalization. And so maybe the fear that Peter feels, that he's able to be intimidated by it because he has available to him the rationalization that, look, I'm doing so for the sake of the non-Judaizer Jewish Christians in Judea. In other words, he could have hidden behind the rationalization that the Judaizers could cause trouble for the other Jewish Christians in Judea by enlisting the help of the non-Christian Jews to help pressure the non-Judaizer Christian Jews into adopting their view. That no, Jesus is fine, but you got to go ahead and convert. So he could have rationalized it that way. The problem is, we don't know. We're not told what fueled his action. What we have is we see his history, we see what he did, and we see what went on. Now, what we're certain about is that Peter's conduct was culpable. His conduct was blameworthy. So however you slice it, you can't slice that out of it. His conduct was blameworthy. His conduct was hypocritical. He didn't act from his convictions about what was right. Rather, he deviated from what he knew at some level was right because of fear of the circumcision group. Okay? The Spirit says that expressly through Paul in verses 12 and 13. So whatever the precise pressure point on Peter, and however Peter may have rationalized the conduct, the fact of the matter is, on that occasion, he compromised the truth. And Paul makes that clear. Now, what's also certain is that Paul used the truth of his gospel. He used the truth of the gospel he preached, the truth that Christ provided salvation for mankind apart from the Mosaic law, to rebuke Peter for acting as though salvation required submission to the Mosaic law. So that's clear that the very gospel he preached that says submission to the Mosaic law is not part of the gospel of Christ. He used that gospel to rebuke Peter, who was acting like submission to the Mosaic law was in fact required. And the fact his gospel was used to rebuke a pillar, well, that demonstrates the validity of his gospel, contrary to what the Judaizers are saying. They're saying Paul's stuff is off. It's warped. And Paul's saying the very gospel you're claiming is warped, I used to rebuke a pillar. So do you see what he's doing here? This isn't about Paul sharing this just so people think, well, Paul got the better of Peter on that occasion. That is not what he's doing. That's not it at all. It's to convince the Galatians that his gospel is indeed the truth and that they're in grave danger of turning from it. He's pulling out all the stops to get them to see that you're in danger. You had received the gospel from me and now you're being hoodwinked by these people. And I want you to stop it. And he's letting them know this. Now, if Paul's gospel is some watered down version of the truth, he wouldn't have dared rebuked Peter publicly for violating it. That's just crazy to think of that. You see, in Proverbs 28:1 says, the righteous are as bold as a lion. And Paul's boldness testified to the fact that Paul was right. So Paul was a lion, baby. He was in there. I don't care, pillar or no pillar. When you're acting against the truth of God, in this situation, he had to rebuke him public. Now, Peter's hypocrisy had adversely influenced some of the other Jews, including even Barnabas. It did that even Barnabas. We have to understand that what we do influences other people. Especially if you're in a position of leadership, especially if you have any profile. But this is true for everybody, wherever you are. You have to understand that what you do, it influences people, and that makes it all the more important that we have courage to hold to our convictions in the face of our fears. Right? I mean, that's important. The fact that a spiritual giant, somebody whose shoes you and I couldn't untie, the fact somebody like Peter can be pressured into hypocrisy is sobering. And so we need to be aware of that. Now, if this is the incident that's reported in Acts chapter 15, verses 1 and 2, which seems likely to me, then Paul, what happened then? Well, then Paul presumably convinced Barnabas of his error in following Peter's example, and then Barnabas and Paul together, the restored Barnabas, he's gone with Peter, been pulled by that error. Paul comes and straightens him out. Then Barnabas and Paul argue sharply with the Judaizers there in Antioch, perhaps after Peter's departure. Now, if that's the case, and if Barnabas recovered so quickly from his, theological, quote, slip, well, Luke may have seen no need for mentioning it when he reports in Acts 15:3 that Barnabas was sent with Paul to Jerusalem to see the elders and the apostles about this question. And that's the Jerusalem council visit. Now, some people have speculated that Barnabas' defection in this case, however brief it was, his defection from the gospel, that it may have contributed to Paul and Barnabas going their separate ways. You remember on the second missionary journey? When they're ready, he says, no, John Mark, he deserted us. That's really the stated reason, but some have speculated, but that reason was given so much weight because of this nagging kind of thing. Now, whether there's anything to that, that's not in text. Now, Paul opposed Peter to his face, he says, because Peter was under condemnation. Now, think about it. He was under condemnation. Now, some have taken this to mean, it just means that Peter was self-condemned. In other words, that Peter was condemned in his own heart. And that's how the NRSV renders it. But Richard Longnecker, in his commentary on Galatians, he argues very forcefully that the verb means to be condemned before God, and not just to be blamed, or to be blamed in the wrong, or even self-condemned by the inconsistency of one's own actions. And that's how it's defined in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. Longnecker notes that Josephus regularly used katagnosko to mean condemned to death before God, or a tribunal. And this is how the Ebionites are a later Christian group, quote Christian group, that they're the theological heirs of the Judaizers. And they later understood it to mean that Paul was saying that Peter was condemned by God, and they used that understanding to attack Paul. And so it's not at all odd, and I think that's what it means. And here's what Witherington says in his commentaries, is Peter's actions are on trial before the assembly of the faithful, I heard that bell, and in the presence of God. And Paul is saying he's already condemned before the divine tribunal. Notice that the verb is in the perfect, indicating an already existing state which Peter was in before Paul ever confronted him. In short, Paul's action is taken because he believes that God condemns what Peter has done. And so it's that serious. Now, for you to hold where we are, because I won't be here next week, so that'll never happen, but I'll try to bring us back, and thanks for coming.